Hello there, my name's Brandon and I make pictures out of tiny squares. And in this video I'm putting together another piece for my 1-Bit Detective Boy series. If you haven't seen the previous entries, there's not exactly a continuous story or anything to catch up on. It's just sort of a concept that I'm using to generate these kind of pseudo sci-fi fantasy snapshots in this black and white style. What I'm doing to start is clearing the board from a previous drawing to keep just the template. And the sizing here is 200 by 200 for the full canvas, while the actual illustrated area is 160 by 144. The only real idea I had when starting this was that I wanted to try making a spiral staircase as one of the set pieces, because I've never done that before, and I thought it'd look pretty cool in this style. I've started this by placing all the blocks for the stairs to first try to get the spacing, and my plan was to find a complementary position for the handrails and then erase the excess to create the perspective of the stairs wrapping around. But as you might imagine, it doesn't really take much to start to lose track of the geometry for something like this, especially probably with the way that I planned it out. And so it became harder to find what I was looking for, so I actually just scrapped that first attempt and started again. And the second time I'm paying attention to the orientation of the steps as they wrap behind and in front of that center point. The key is to gradually decrease the rectangle widths, because as they wind around the front, we're going to be looking at the side of the step rather than the front of it. And everything in between will use widths that generate sort of an arcing silhouette between that. I've also shaded a series of steps on one side of the staircase to use the idea of there being light source in emphasizing this circular layout. For the handrail, I first tried to freehand it into place using a 2-pixel brush, and then kind of nudge things around after that. But it was sort of problematic to balance that arcing motion on both sides of that line. Plus it was just kind of looking a bit chunky anyway. So I went back to the original idea of placing down the individual posts first, and then created the railing as a single pixel line. The benefit here is that it's easier to balance out the pixel segments with just a small line like this, and the thinner profile looks more in scale and doesn't obscure the steps also. From here I started thinking how this could actually work as being sort of a clock tower room. The spiral staircase made me think about rotating gears and other mechanical things like that. So I'm creating a large gear to put into the floor. And I'm using a base construction of 8 points because that's going to provide very favorable directions for building out the pixel art. I'm taking those guide points and basically just widening them out to create some angled cogs. And then to make the whole thing look a bit more interesting, I created a few layers of circles and some line work and dithering within the gears. For the rest of the room, I wanted to play off this clock tower motif, but rather than just sticking gears everywhere, I thought it'd be fun to play with the imagery of clocks in general, and just kind of embed them as part of the room tiling. This seemed like a good setting to have some kind of boss encounter or like a confrontational moment. So I'm also building a stage platform which can just help add a little bit of theatrics to a room like this. A lot of the decor is drawing inspiration from clocks and little mechanical pieces. And the most important thing that I like to play with on something like this is just making sure that there's a good variety of shapes and sizes and textures of pieces like this. I found some of this was starting to lean into kind of an Art Deco vibe, and so I kept playing with that contrast between these solid, simple forms and smaller, intricate textures on various pieces. The joy for me with this series is just in generating a scene without much justification to it. Sort of like it's just a snapshot that has some backstory that we're all kind of unaware of. And after doing a lap around the room, there's now the clock theme going, there's this idea of the boss and the stage, and kind of all this mixed ornate detailing. So together, it's all generating this sort of feel that suggests a little bit more about this world. Up along the top I've got the HUD, and again this is carried over from the previous pieces, but for this one I've made a few changes to update the things that we do know about this world so far. So in the previous video for the series, I made a piece showing his robotic arm and how it's like an important accessory or ability. And so I've made sure to work in some of that imagery from last time into the HUD on this one. For the boss encounter, I also remembered that I'd created a character named Hex, who I was referring to as being a time thief, someone that can steal and manipulate time. She wasn't related to this series, it was more or less kind of a one-off design, but I thought she'd actually be perfect for this role just because of that trait, obviously. One of the changes that I'm making for this adaptation is that I'm giving her wings. I wanted to try something that was a little bit more fantasy-like for this setting. And later I want to do like a wing flapping animation, which is something else I don't think I've ever attempted. To get started on the animation work, it's important to consider what the longest looping motions of the background are going to be. I began by animating this pendulum since it'll be important that it's able to make a constant back and forth swinging motion, and that will likely inform what other frequencies are possible elsewhere in the animation. After placing the circle around in this sort of half arcing motion, I connected the arm back up and then mirrored that movement to create the full swing. By just sort of eyeballing something that felt about right, I ended up with a 10 frame animation, which doesn't actually offer the best amount of subdivisions and multiples for other rhythms, but we'll just continue on and see. The next important animation is going to be the large gear off at the far wall, because just like the pendulum, I want to have it moving with a constant and seamless motion. What I'm doing is paying attention to the height of the individual cogs as they rotate and kind of distort while rounding along that extreme edge. And I'm just looking for the spot where the current cog can actually become the starting position of the next one, thus completing what will appear to be a seamless rotation. To play with this perception is almost an optical illusion, I guess, or just sort of an efficiency in finding what looks like you think is happening. And in this case, I only needed 3 frames to make that movement possible. Now, since this doesn't line up nicely with the 10 frame count of the pendulum animation, unless we wanted to multiply the total count out to 30, what I did was just go back in and add 2 more frames into the pendulum, and that way it now completes its arc over a total of 12 frames, and the large 3 frame gear animation can synchronize together in that count. A total frame count of 12 just gives a lot more options to work with anyway, since we can now create various rhythms of mini loops within any division of 12 that we want. Next, I'm moving on to the large gears in the floor, and I don't want them to be constantly in motion, just kind of want to have them like clunk along every so often. So what I'm trying to do here is find a position off the original axis, not exactly halfway between where the cogs are though, because I actually want it to favor one side over the other just a little bit. And this was really tricky to do because it's now no longer aligned to those perfect angles that were favorable for the pixel art. And because this is the 1-bit style, also we don't even have the advantage of using anti-aliasing to smooth out the edges. Still, I kept evening out these edges. And what's actually cool here though is that because it's not exactly halfway between the original cog positions, what I did was I mirrored this new in-between sprite, and that gave yet another position. So here's a look at kind of the first draft of those frames, and you can see that sort of sluggish, clunking motion that I was trying to get. After tidying up a few of the edges, I duplicated the animation and mirrored it to create the complementary gear that's going to sit next to that original. So putting these two together with the first 2 animations, we've got that pendulum looping every 12 frames, the large gear looping every 3, and then the floor gear is making one of those clunks every 6 frames. And that's kind of the key in finding the room frequency first. So now I'm moving on to some character animation with the wings for Hex. As I mentioned, I've never done this sort of thing before, but basically if you can imagine, or just like flap your arms like how you think a bird would, that's essentially the movement I'm trying to create here. This is one of those cases where I like to create all the individual frames that I think I'll need ahead of time. And then once I've got those several pieces worked out, I'll put them together in some kind of sequence and then just review it and change it as necessary. In this case, it ended up being a total of 5 unique frames, with a couple repeats in there, obviously, while filling out that space of the 12 frame total. Additionally, I'm bobbing the whole thing up and down evenly just to emphasize that movement. I'm also adding in some dialogue here, and rather than doing like a big text box or something, I just wanted to see what it'd look like with the lettering right within the piece like this. And you can also see that I've added a pop of color to the hourglass that Hex is holding. Now, I'm aware that this deviates now from the definition of being 1-bit at this point, but I love these sort of pops of color as just a way to show importance for an object like this. Alright, so let's go ahead and take a look at the final piece. Here's the 1-bit detective boy in part 4, the clock tower. All right, one thing I wanted to mention was that the idle animations for the boy and the cat come directly from a previous illustration. I'd done more of a breakdown about those in that video if you're curious about those ones. Other than that, I just wanted to pull back the curtain here to highlight the rest of those synchronized room animations. Again, these are all occurring within intervals of the original 12 frame space. And then those 12 frames were multiplied out just to give enough time to have the dialogue text appear. And the little alarm clock too, I think that one rings every 24 frames. And we'll close out with some CRT time. So thank you for watching, and take care and keep it square.